Testing. Hey YouTube. Once again, we are live here from the 21st century. What the only topic that I've got in my head this week is hey Joel, could I get a sound check just to make sure I'm not echoing? What the topic that I would like to discuss today is what the future, thanks man, what the future of our hobby is going to look like. What is the fish keeping hobby going to look like in 20 years or 40 years when some of you that watch are who are young now, are my age? What 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 is the hobby going to be in the year 2050? What's the hobby going to be in the year 2070? And I think it's a good thing to think about. I think it's something that we as fish keepers need to recognize that we're on the front lines, or more appropriately, some of the younger of you are on the front lines. You're going to have a front row seat to what the hobby actually is in the future. I mean, there's a lot of things that our hobby is facing, and this stuff goes on all the time, every day, every week, every month, every year, every decade. We are facing a future where regulation may try to strangle the hobby. We may no longer be able to import fish. We may no longer be able to, I mean, it's entirely possible that there won't be many fish to import, actually. The way our current assault on the planet is going, the amounts of wild fish that are brought into the country may drop. You know, right now that's not happening. Right now, more than ever, you can get different and varied wild caught animals from all over the world and have them shipped to you. If you've got the proper certification, they can ship them right to the airport under your name. Or if you don't have that kind of certification, you can go through transshippers, or you can go through regular channels where pet stores ship them in, and then you ship them, they ship them to you. You know, they're the seller and you are the buyer, and you get fish. Sometimes these are wild caught, sometimes these are captive bred. But in the last 20 or 30 years, there have been a lot of changes in the pets hobby, you know, of different varieties of pets, dogs, cats. And a lot of these changes reflect what's going on. You know, there's puppy mills out there where dogs are treated abominably and just kind of like in a mill where they're just pumping out puppies for sale and they're not treated well and they're not cared for properly. And so, because of that, um, legislatures have tried to outlaw that sort of things, and it's getting harder and harder to buy dogs from a pet store, a local pet store. In some places, you can't do that anymore. I'm fighting a group of, I guess they might be fruit flies, but I'm not sure. Anyway, these kinds of legislative assaults, if you were, on the hobby are encroaching on what we recognize as our hobby. There's a good chance that medications will no longer be available without a vet prescribing them to you and buying them through some sort of veterinary channel. And that's not occurred here yet, but it's occurring in Canada, and it's occurring a lot of places around the world, and that's going to have a profound effect on what we as fish keepers are going to be able to do, or more probably on how expensive it's going to be to keep our fish alive or treat them with the methods that we've become accustomed to. There's a lot of vendors that immediately treat their fish. They run them through a medicated what's the word? They use medications immediately upon fish's arrival that are suspect, that might have parasites or diseases. Immediately upon quarantining these fish, they run them through a series of treatments. And in some cases, this is a really excellent plan of attack. It's understandable from a profit sense of view that these kinds of broad spectrum, yeah, that's a good word, but that's not really what I was looking for, Joel. But yeah, a broad spectrum treatment program, and that kind of stuff could potentially change in the sense that it may become so expensive to buy the medications that are involved with that. If a pet store now has to have a vet prescribe all of the chemicals that they require to do their normal methodology of treatment, then that's going to add quite a bit to the cost of those fish. And fish are pretty darned expensive right now, and if you add a whole nother layer on top of that, they could get outrageously expensive. You could be paying hundreds of dollars for fish that we recognize as quite common in the hobby. But these are all the kinds of ways that legislative creep can enter our hobby and cause us to have much less available to us. One, because of the expense, and two, because certain importers may no longer be able to import fish. It may no longer be a viable business to import fish because of the expense involved. or because of legislative hurdles that they have to jump over to get the fish into the country, and the added expense that those things. And what I'm getting at here is that we can't just sit back on our hands and watch all this stuff happen. Um, Whether you recognize it or not, as fish keepers, you are part of what happens in this hobby, that unless you are willing to become engaged in what's going on in the hobby, then you can expect to be without control as to what goes on, unless you are willing to become involved and to add your voice to the people that are trying to understand exactly what kind of legislation needs to happen as to the fish keeping hobby. Then if they get no excuse me, if they get no input from hobbyists and they just operate on what they think is best, and these are the people that pass the laws I'm talking about, then the laws are probably not going to be favorable to the hobbyist. And so it is required as hobbyists to become engaged in the process. You know, Joel's from New Zealand, uh, down that way in that part of the world. They have a lot of issues about what kinds of fish they can get. And Australia is particularly affected by this. There's a great deal of um, hoops that one has to jump through down there to just get some types of fish. And some types of fish they can't get at all, period. Someone almost has to smuggle those fish in and breed them. And Joel says, yeah, totally. Only becomes more strict with time and more expensive. And if we are it's terrible knowing a great many different types of words, but not being able to pull them up. And it's made up for by a small handful of desperately enthusiastic hobbyists. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, Joel. That's basically my topic for today, is that unless we are willing to be part of that small handful of desperately enthusiastic hobbyists that you point a finger towards, then we have to accept whatever it is that the legislators and legislation brings down upon our heads. We have no voice because we chose not to have a voice. And when you have no voice, you have no way of affecting the outcome. And that's why I'm stating that it is up to the young in this hobby, it is up to the middle-aged in this hobby to actively engage on the front of what our hobby is going to become. Are we going to become extinct? Are there going to be no more fish keepers? Are there going to be no more hobbyists involved with keeping. Joel says try a choline supplement like alpha GPC or just eat lots of eggs. Raising your acetylcholine levels will help with the world retrieval. Word retrieval. Ah, okay. Maybe so. Maybe I need to eat more eggs. Um, I just think it's aging process, Joel. I'm just reaching that age where stuff starts failing, and and I'm experiencing it, and you're experiencing it in real time with me as I fail to pull a word out of my memory bank. Anyway, I just think that it is really even more so now than when I was a young hobbyist. You know, when I was a young hobbyist, the kind of things that faced us were, 30, yeah, 30-ish. When I was a young hobbyist, I, the kinds of things that faced the hobby were figuring out what was out there in the wild, getting enough people to go out and actually catalog and find new species, find new areas where new species might be discovered. Um, the world was still relatively unexplored, and the honest truth is, the world is still relatively unexplored, but the destruction of natural habitat has reached such a monumental momentum that it is actually eating up undiscovered areas faster than people can get out there and catalog what's in them. Hey, Flynn, welcome to the stream, man. Haven't seen you in a while. Um, so, Flynn, this little topic that I'm discussing, hey, Candy, this little topic that I'm discussing is of particular importance to you. You live in Canada, so you are firsthand experiencing what legislation is doing to fish keepers. You are experiencing medications being pulled from the market. Hey, down the wormhole, how's it going? Um, it is incumbent on the young people in this hobby to engage in what's going on legislatively in our hobby. It is, if you do not, if you choose to not become involved, if you choose to watch what's happening go by without any engagement, then you will be helpless to change what our hobby looks like in the next 20 or 30 years. The changes that come down. Flynn says the medication bans are quite painful, especially working in a live fish store when you have very few meds to give. It's difficult. Yeah, it's basically going to be dyes and salts and water changes. Unless you or your live fish store are willing to pay a vet to prescribe those medications and to pay the added expense of the medications coming through. Sharpie's Models and Aquatics says, welcome to the European methods of medicating fish. Yeah, see, we here in the United States are not even aware of this yet. We have not even begun to recognize what's coming, that all of our medications are going to disappear, that we're no longer going to have access to them. And if you think about this, it's it's uh, it's perfectly understandable why this sort of thing is going on. One of the highest costs, and I can only speak to it here in the United States, one of our highest expenses is health care. One of the things we pay more money for than anything else is health care in this day and age. Sharpie says antibiotics of any kind have been banned for decades in the UK without prescription through a vet. Yeah. And if you go to the doctor and you are prescribed erythromycin for some kind of malady that you're experiencing or some kind of illness that you're going through, um, actually erythromycin is probably not the best example because erythromycin, while expensive, is not that expensive. But it's still way more money than buying a gallon jug of erythromycin from a pet vendor. And while the chemical equivalency of the erythromycin that you buy from a pet vendor is not the same, it's not okayed for human use. There are people out there in this country that are so poor that they understand they need a a prescription of erythromycin, but they can't afford to pay for a prescription of erythromycin. And some of them will inevitably turn to going to a pet store and buying erythromycin for veterinary use off the shelf at a much reduced price. As expensive as we feel like it is when we go and pay for our pet meds, it's much less expensive than a doctor's office visit and a prescription through our local drugstore. So some people will buy that medication and use it on themselves, which creates all kinds of issues as far as over medication because they don't understand exactly how much they need to give themselves, or creating drug resistant bacterias because they don't take the medication long enough, or because they don't properly prescribe it, or because the medication that they're taking is not exactly like the medication that they would be prescribed and get through a drugstore. So there are a lot of reasons why it makes sense from a legislative point of view to remove those kinds of potentially problematic drugs from pet store shelves. But never underestimate the monetary side of things. And Sharpie says it's not exactly unknown for low-income pensioners to buy cat or dog food for themselves either. And this is exactly the case. It's true that people who are on a fixed income, and I can wave my frozen shouldered hand, on that. Um, People on a fixed income, because of the rising costs around us, are often faced with the choice of buying drugs or buying food and paying for utilities to keep the gas on or to keep the electric on or to keep the internet on. Uh, you often can be placed in a situation quite unrealized earlier that you are suddenly so poor that you may have to buy dog food to eat instead of some kind of canned meat. You can't afford Spam anymore. You've got to buy Alpo. And the same thing is happening with medications. People are going in and buying them for use on themselves or their children. You know, my child is ill. I've got to have these antibiotics, but I can't afford them. But if I go in a pet store, I can pay $8 and I get a whole package of that medication. Sharpie says the choice between turning on a heater or eating is one that shouldn't happen in a first world country, but it does. Yeah. And what most people don't recognize is that that's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse because people whose only focus is the bottom line, how much money they or maybe even their investors are making is more important than people's lives. People's lives are disposable, and people's lives are only matter if they have enough money for them to matter. You know, when the world suddenly becomes that stark, that much black and white, then people that can't afford to do something are going to be shoved to the side, you know, and that's not what my topic is here today. Uh, my topic here today is that as fish keepers in this hobby, we need to be actively engaged in viewing what is going on in the world around us that is affecting our hobby. We need to see these issues coming. We need to have an ear towards what legislative bodies are doing. Sharpies, I find it even more frustrating. And I would spend 6 weeks ranting and raving about it. But I probably shouldn't foist that off on people who live in other countries, people who are only interested in fish keeping at this point and not really interested in hearing a commie pinko fag talk about politics. And I use that term, commie pinko fag, as a badge of honor because that's what I was called way back in the day. That was what liberals were called by arch conservatives way back when. And I find it particularly interesting that the arch conservatives are now involved with the Russians right up to the hip, taking money from them. Okay. Enough said about that subject. I will just simply say, please watch the hearings if you live in the United States. Please use discernment and rational thinking and get out of your bubbles and watch what's actually going on. And that kind of thinking that says to do that is fundamentally the exact same kind of thinking that is needed by hobbyists in this day and age to try to see ahead far enough to make sure, we've got to be realistic. We've got to understand that, hey, maybe it's not a great idea that poor people are buying medications off the shelf in pet stores that we're using to keep our fish with, and that they're misusing those. Maybe that's not a good choice. Maybe that's not an effective way for this to happen. But is having to go to a vet and pay $100 vet visit bill and then just get one prescription for one kind of medication for a one-time use and pay an extra $75 for that prescription compared to what we would be paying at the... I don't know if you've noticed, if you don't have dogs or cats or some kinds of animals that you've been taking to a vet, vet visits are outrageously expensive. There's people that pay 10 grand for pet insurance these days that gives them the right to take their pets in whenever they want and get them treated. Well, I'm not sure that 10 grand or that 13 grand a year would cover fish keeping medication as well. You can spend an outrageous amount of money, and unless we want this hobby to become the province of ultra wealthy people, the only people that can afford to keep fish anymore are people that have so much expendable income that nothing is a deterrent to them, that they can spend millions of dollars on their fish keeping. Our hobby can be done relatively cheap. We can buy used tanks. We can get fish from local clubs or local breeders, sometimes free, because the breeders have so many they're trying to get rid of them. And we can buy used equipment, or we can find equipment, or we can make our own equipment, or we can buy one piece of equipment like an air stone, like a air pump. It's possible to do this hobby very cheaply. That doesn't mean that what you're doing is cheap. It just means that it's possible to get by without spending a great deal of money on this hobby. And it affords people that are really too poor to do a lot of hobbies a way to enjoy something in their homes without spending a whole lot of money. Well, unless you are willing to see that go by the wayside, unless you are willing to watch no one be able to afford to keep fish anymore, that it is only the province of the ultra wealthy because of the intense expenses involved, then it behooves you to get off your duffs and become engaged with the political world around you that is having an effect on your hobby, that is creating pressures on your hobby that as a hobbyist you don't really understand. You don't really You don't even see it coming. And it is not seeing it coming and having it land in your lap and suddenly being forced to deal with it that is exactly the wrong way to deal with these kinds of legislative things that affect the future of this hobby. And that's not to mean that we need to become militant activists that are firebombing um, legislative houses. It's not to mean that we need to become vicious uh, defenders of our quote, quote, territory. That's not what this is about. What this is about is becoming knowledgeable enough, becoming engaged enough, just a little bit of money that is put in the right kitty that funds people who are acutely aware of these issues and understand exactly where the problems lie in the legislation that's being put forward can really have a huge effect on how that legislation turns out and how it affects us as fish keepers, what it does to the hobby. And it's just really fundamentally important in my way of thinking. This is my opinion that you as new hobbyists, as hobbyists that are reaching the point where you are really becoming skilled in this hobby, that are reaching the point where you are beginning to look around in the hobby and see things in a light that you never saw them before. You're going to conventions, you're getting talks, you're checking out papers, you're checking out the bleeding cutting edge of our hobby. Well, one of the places you need to focus your attention is on the cutting, bleeding edge of how legislation, how commerce, how habitat in the wild are all going to affect the future of our hobby. And you need to be on your toes. You need to be plugged in to enough different groups where you are suddenly getting timely information about the kinds of things that are going on in our hobby. The, the, the legislation that is on the horizon that is going to change the way our hobby happens for the next 50 years or the next 60 years. It's on you. You are the ones that can become engaged, that can donate small amounts of money as a large group, that will fund lawyers that know exactly where the problems are in the legislation and can change how that legislation gets passed and can remove parts of that legislation that will critically affect what happens to us as fish keepers or us as pet owners. Those are the kinds of things. And to do that, you need to probably connect with groups that you've never thought of connecting before. Maybe you hate big box stores, but big box stores are part of a group of pet industry members that band together And you can look these groups up and find their names and find out. Phil Emerson says, I didn't realize government overreach affected our hobby. Man, that's exactly what my topic is today. I didn't realize government overreach affected our hobby. Man, because it is critical that we realize that government overreach affects our hobby, and instead of man, do something about it. Instead of man, become engaged. Instead of man, open our eyes to the proper channels for us to become aware of, for us to become engaged with, for us to become a part of, so that we can have some effect on legislation that will affect us as hobbyists and will affect the future of this hobby. You know, if 50 years from now there is no fish hobbyist, if 50 years from now there is no fish keeping hobby, we're going to have no one to blame but ourselves, because we did not actively engage with the pressures, both economically and politically and climate-wise and ecology-wise, that are removing our hobby from a possible thing to do. We have to protect our hobby. And I don't mean protect as in it's time to go buy Tommy guns. I mean protect as in it's time to become aware. It's time to become engaged. It's time to become someone that understands what's actually going on in the world around them enough that they know where the place is that they need to put their foot down and say, this can't go on. You can no longer force me to pay 10 times what I'm paying now for my hobby to go on. Okay, if you want me to pay twice as much to get my medication for my fish, you know, I'm not going to like that. I'm not going to want to stand by and let that happen. But I'm much more likely to accept that than I am to accept suddenly paying 10 times as much. Yep, heater. That's a little bit even before Tommy guns. That's when they still heated up in your hand while you were using them. It's an upgrade from muzzle loaders. Yep. Joel says he will die for the hobby. I'm not advocating that. I'm not advocating that anybody get out on any kind of ledge and threaten to throw themselves off the ledge. I'm not advocating any sort of unsensible kinds of actions. I am advocating to become very mainstream. I am advocating to become very much on the scene of how this sort of thing happens. I mean, the medication thing, that's probably history. There's probably nothing that we can do about the fact that we will soon lose the ability to buy medications for anything less than 100 times what we're usually used to paying for these medications, or 20 times what we're usually paying for these medications. And and that's just going to become the norm. So it's like Sharpies was saying, welcome to the European method. We're no longer going to have antibiotics. We're no longer going to have many different kinds of medications that we have become accustomed to using. Oh, it's this disease. This is the medication to use. Boom, I've got plenty of that. I check the expiration date. If it's way past the expiration date, I'm going to run down to the big box store and buy another box of it for $10, and I will use that, and boom, the issue is solved. Sharpie says, I can look into what we use for medication over here and ask in my stream. If I find one thing that helps one person, it's worth it. Hey, Pam, welcome to the stream. How's Pam today? Pam, we're talking about subterfuge and the masses taking over the world. We're talking about becoming engaged as fish keepers so that the future of our hobby looks something like our hobby does today, instead of some kind of ghost of what the hobby used to be. There's a lot of legislative stuff going on that is really going to affect how our hobby happens here in the USA. And we can see how that's working in Europe and lately in Canada, with all kinds of medications being banned from the Sharpie says, I managed to beat Columnaris with Pimafix, Melafix, and salt. I have Pimafix and Melafix, both. I have used them for decades and decades, sometimes with mixed result, sometimes with good results. So I cannot effectively stand here and tell you that if you go buy a bottle of Pimafix and you go buy a bottle of Melafix, that you'll actually be able to treat a problem in your tank. Now, Sharpies has managed to battle Columnaris with it, and I find that extremely encouraging, that a minor medication, and I use that term loosely because basically it's just extracts from trees, and but I mean, aspirin is extract from trees, extract from plants. You know, all of our medication is extracts or some extrapolation of what's found in nature. So it's really possible to effectively manage pathogens and diseases in our hobby without resorting to heavy medications. I've always been one that chose I have always been one that chose to lightly medicate. Oftentimes I lose fish because of instead of going to the shotgun, i.e. Erythromycin or tetracycline or some heavy duty chemical, I tend to lean on things like Pimafix and Melafix and salt and Epsom salts and water changes and lighter versions, Aquasol, the kinds of things that are not heavy duty medications. I've always erred on the side of under medicating, and occasionally that creates a situation where I have to go through a whole regime of under medicating and then end up having to over medicate with heavy medications on top of it. And that's always an unhappy situation where I'm faced with the fact that all I've done is extended the length of time that this malady was affecting my fish by under-medicating and not solving the problem instantly by using heavier medications. But it's really hard on your fish to use heavy medications. That's not to say that they won't survive it. That's not to say that they can't come out on the other side with a much better chance at surviving long term, i.e. you've gotten rid of some really nasty bugs that were in them that while they weren't affecting them right then, that later on in life when there is some stress that affects them, power goes out and the water quality drops, and suddenly they are in such a stressful situation. No, Jeremy, we're no longer alive. I died 3 years ago. This is just a video recording that is run through a robot. Pam's still alive. Hey, Biggies, welcome to the stream. Hey, Jeremy Morrell, welcome to the stream. That should tell you that it is indeed still a live stream. Yeah, me too, Bob. I just, if nothing else, I want the end result of everyone that watches this video that suddenly feels a itch to go find some pet industry organization that is involved with legislation, that is involved with watching what's on the legislative horizon and seeing what's coming up to affect. We're all just simulated AIs portraying human beings. Yep. The whole world is gone in a puff of smoke, and this is just the AI continuing to act like we're still alive. G-E-E, welcome to the stream. I just want to ask the young people in the hobby, what is the hobby? You know, people ask me all the time, you're old, what was the hobby like 40 years ago? And what I want to do is to say, you're young. What is the hobby going to look like 40 years from now? And if you don't get off your butts and become engaged in what's affecting our hobby, it is going to be hugely, muchly, to use some Kentucky words, hugely, muchly different than what it's like right now. I took it and I'm enjoying all the fluffy kitten time. Well, enjoy, Nisi. Um, it's just really scary to me. I mean, I'm not going to be here to see it. Bob might live that long. Bob might live to be 120 years old. And Pam will probably make it, but I'm probably not going to make it to 120 years old. I've been rode hard and stabled wet, and I'm probably going to cash it in here in the next 10 or 20 years. And it's not going to be any skin off of my nose if there is no hobby in 2050 or 2060 or 2070. I'm not going to miss it because I'm going to be in the ground. I'm going to be taking a long, well-deserved dirt nap. And it's you guys that are going to suffer in this hobby if you're not willing to become engaged with it. Bob says, sometimes I feel like it's a game to youngsters and not a hobby. Well, Bob, I look around at what's going on in the world now, and I think back to 40, 50 years ago when all the silent generation and the generation that fought World War II were looking at us and saying they've all lost their mind. Nisi says just find a reputable breeder and keep single species tanks if it gets that intense. I won't buy local fish anymore. Too much risk with minimal payoff. And Jeremy Morrell says you win by getting the most social media likes. And Phil says one would think the hobby is growing leaps and bounds with all the stores and other online stores. Yeah, that is what one would think. And this hobby has survived the Great Depression. This hobby has survived all kinds of economic downturns. When things get really bad economically, people tend to turn to fish keeping as a hobby that gives them a great deal of pleasure and enjoyment. When they can't afford to do other things, they still manage to afford to keep fish. And I would like to see that continue. I would like to think that in the year 2222, that there would be enough wild habitat that's able to support wild fish, that there would be enough reality in our political thinking that it is possible to still keep fish in a tank at home. I hope that in that year, tetragranules are still available and still being bought, that Hikari has become a multinational conglomerate that is supporting both wild ecology and has multi-million dollar awards programs that are being awarded to different fields of fish keeping endeavor. That technology has become so advanced that you don't need a glass tank anymore. You just set up a force field that's adjustable, and you fill it with water, and your fish appear to be floating in air with no visible reflections or no visible equipment lines anywhere in the tank. DC says true. When I get blue, I buy something alive. Plants, pets, or feeders. General rule is if I can keep it alive, then I'm winning at something, and boom, blue moment over. And I think that says what our hobby is exactly in a nutshell, Nisi. I think that that is the basis underneath what we all do as hobbyists. And I want that to continue. I want that to be available in 100 years. Jeremy Morrell says power outages would be a bummer for force field tanks. Yep, buddy. That would mean that you would need to have a 5-hour charge on that force field tank, or a 10-day charge on that force field tank, so that if the power went out, it would actually still hold. But I mean, that's what I'm saying. I hope the hobby continues that long. I hope that fish keeping is as much fun in the 24th century as it is in the 21st century. But for that to happen, everyone needs to become engaged with what is happening in our hobby, with what is affecting our hobby. And that's just my rant, my thought for the day, that it is really critical that we not be in this little tiny enclosed bubble and we never look outside of it. We need to be engaged with the world. We need to be using rationale. We need to be using logical reasoning to deal with the world. The Dwain Kitchel Force Field Aquarium. Yeah, that'll be fine. I would love to go down in history as the progenitor of the idea of a force field aquarium. Someone else has thought of it long ago. I'm sorry to dissuade you of that idea. All right, guys, that's my rant for the day. That's my wish that I'm sending out into the cyberspace, that people would become aware of and engaged in. Now to start moving the plants home because Jeremy scared me into it. I'll blame you when Doug rolls his eyes at me. Okay, Nisi. You guys have a good rest of the weekend. While I'm expecting you to put one eye on what's going on in the world around you, I fully well expect you to keep the other eye on what's going on in the tanks at home. All right, guys. Have a good rest of your weekend. And good luck with your fish keeping. Thanks for